the desire is or rather also connected to this is desire, the sense that we thought that if the public liturgy wasn't happening, that there was no sort of liturgy of the heart. There was none of that sacrifice taking place. Now, I've recently been preparing to teach this, but this is a book by Mechteld. It's entitled The Book of Special Grace. And she writes in this book, she's lived at Helfta and in the 14th century with other sort of famous monastic women, including Gertrude and another Mechteld. So there's and another Gertrude. It was a very complicated time. One night when she was unable to sleep, she said to the Lord, "Ah, how good and fitting it would be to talk with you in this time of silence," right? She was left alone in this time of silence. In fact, she was in a kind of infirmary and couldn't go out. He answered, "You could never be in a crowd so large that you could not be alone with me if you turned to me with all your heart." And suddenly she saw an object like a crown in the shape of a ciborium descending from heaven onto her bed, and covering the whole bed, it was made of white and red pearls. The red one signified Christ's blood, which he poured out as freely as it had no value at all. The white ones denoted his innocence, holy way of life. And so it continues on, and in this Eucharistic image, she sees the fierceness and yet the tender fierceness of the Savior's presence. She also saw the open heart of Christ, and within it was a burning flame as two palm trees. Yet it did not have the appearance of fire. Its color was marvelous, its form indescribable. And the Lord said, "This is how I want all people's hearts to burn within them in the fire of charity." When a person is alone, let that person always lift up his heart to God, conversing with him sweetly, yearning for him deeply, sighing for him intimately. In this way, constant conversation with God will make his heart fire divine love. If he is with other people, let him always be as attentive to God as he can and gladly tell them about him. Thus he will kindle love in himself and others. Whatever he does, let him do it for God's sake. And let him willingly accept anything he finds difficult or painful for the love of God and bear it patiently. That is, to the life of the Christian for Mechteld is not lived with desire only in the liturgy, but is possible outside of it. And this desire to constantly converse with Christ, right? In the silence of one heart, when you're around your family, even when your kids are being obnoxious, when you see another and want to preach the gospel to one another, this is all part of the desire. And I think this has been forgotten and must be retrieved. Lastly, I want to say something briefly about the body and fasting. Often, right after COVID, I heard many people, and I even heard a couple of say, "No more fasting," right? It's over. Your fasting is now become different, right? Your fasting is you can't see anyone ever, and you have to be on Zoom all day. So there is a truth to this. It was a time of suffering. But one of the things this forgot, and we think needs to be theologically retrieved, is the role of the body in actual worship, right? There's a materiality to the act of worship, and that fasting is not just a practice we do because we despise ourselves and look forward to owning, to having a body controlled in preparation for Lent, but because through that desire, we learn to desire God. And that's part of that offering that's made. It's part of that devotional offering that is made. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite my two colleagues to speak on interrelated topics, but they're not going to address what I just said. The first is Dr. Brett Robinson, Director of Communications and Media Studies at the McGrath Institute, and he's going to address a dimension that I think that popped up a lot in the midst of COVID, the interrelationship between devotion and prayer. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Tim. And if my audio starts to cut out, please let me know. Just interrupt me so I can see if I can fix it. I'm going to, I guess, come at this a little bit obliquely. So my background is in media studies. So I'm very interested and concerned about what happens, particularly in the home around technology use and media and so forth. So this has been a unique time because a lot of the kind of theoretical or abstract ideas around what media and technology are doing in the home and to devotion or with devotion have become very real as we've made these transitions into different forms of worship and liturgy, watching it online and so forth. So with that as a caveat, I'm a media studies person. I am so grateful to be at the Institute because I think my interest in the sort of intersection of media and religion and theology requires a theological perspective, obviously. So to be surrounded by people like Tim and Carolyn and the rest of my colleagues has been immensely helpful in my own thinking and why I'm so pleased to be with all of you here today, because I think this could be a really interesting, hopefully, conversation and dialogue about the intersection of media, technology, and theology. So I was reminded when Tim was talking about Mechtel's vision, about the vision of St. Clare when she was ill and was able to view the Mass. It was projected sort of in a vision on the wall of her cell. And this was a great grace for her, obviously. But it also, I guess, became the impetus for her becoming the patron of television, the patron saint of television. And so I'm often reminded of that story when we have gathered in our basement around the television to view the liturgy and all that entails, and sort of the problems with that, but also some of the really unique opportunities that have arisen out of that. For example, it's very hard to teach your children the liturgy when you're at the liturgy with other people and trying to maintain some silence and decorum. But when you're in your home, obviously, and in the privacy of your home, you can have conversations while the liturgy is happening without disrupting others in the church about what's happening in the liturgy. What does this mean? What does that gesture mean? What does this prayer mean? Our kids, 5 kids, range in age from 14 to 4 months. So there's lots of different conversations happening, but I found that to be actually quite fruitful and a real opportunity for catechesis and engagement on that level. So I do want to talk a little bit about the idea or the relationship between technology and media and what's happening in the home, especially in the devotional life. But again, I want to do it kind of in a maybe more general sense, and then in the discussion and Q&A, we can get into some of the particulars. So Tim had mentioned to me, basically the prompt was why we should be careful with the digital in this domain. So I started to think about sort of what the domestic church means, what it is, what is it for, and I think I want to start with the domestic. What is the home for? So, it's a place where we engage in the work of fulfilling everyday needs, right? So we gather or produce and prepare food. We have conversations with others. We build relationship with our family. We engage in recreation. So in the form of storytelling or music or dance or artistic expression. We do quieter things like reading, reflection, and also we fulfill that need for silence and solitude that we often need. And so all those activities happen in the home on a regular basis. It kind of defines the home in a way. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the home, like the church and like society, has this kind of metaphysical standing because it's intrinsic to who we are as human beings. We're not purely practical creatures, right? We seek higher ends than just feeding ourselves and hanging out. So in some sense, households are, we're together for the sake of being together. That's a good in and of itself. There's a great article by John Cuddeback, recent article on kind of technology in the home and some of these problems as it relates to pursuing a life of virtue, pursuing happiness. And so I think those topics are related here. So I'd like to include those as we go along. So to answer the question, what is the domestic family? What is the family for? We want to include both conceptions. So the practical activities that we pursue, the ones I mentioned, and also the ends that we're pursuing. So we could say with Aristotle that the household is for living lives of virtue in pursuit of happiness. So if we look at that list that I mentioned, and I'm going to try to share my screen here momentarily. All right, so we look at these activities, these everyday needs: food, conversation, recreation, reading and reflection, quiet and observation. Then we ask ourselves sort of what, there's sort of a spectrum here from the active to the contemplative, right? So at the top, we have more of the activity of daily life. And as we move down the list into reflection and quiet and observation, we have that contemplative. And so there's a balance here. There's an ecology that's necessary to maintain, to create the conditions for the pursuit of virtue, but also for the interior life and the devotional life, which the family can engage in. And we need all of these things, right, to do that. And you can see there is even a kind of liturgical aspect here, especially with the preparation of food. So when you gather at the table, that ritual of breaking bread together has these, shades of the liturgical as well. So the question becomes, what happens when media and technology and these other elements become part of this ecosystem or this ecology of the home, part of our management of it, or the economy of the home. And we see this transformation that's gone on through modernity, and we can take each one in its turn, right? The production and preparation of food has gone from, farming your own food and so forth, to factory farming, and then TV dinners and microwaves and fast food. And now we can get on an app on the phone and have our food delivered to us. So that work that would connect us to the natural order, the production of the food, the planting of the seed, the preparation of it, has been sundered for many people. One of the gifts for our family of COVID, if there are gifts of it, has been the time and attention to a garden, something that often took a back seat to all the other activities that the family engages in when school's in full swing, and soccer and swimming and so forth. So growing a garden, preparing the food together, using the food that we grow, connecting us to the natural order. So that's not explicitly devotional, but it is a way in which we can cultivate the perception and the perspective and the attitude necessary to enter into a devotional life more fully, because it's our engagement with the natural order, with creation. The metaphors are there for understanding God, and so on. So that's one example. We could look at conversation, of course. The classic example now is the breakdown in conversation as people are, as Sherry Turkle says, alone together, right? So we're in the room together, but we're all on our phones. Nobody's talking to each other. They're just texting and reading what they want to read. So we might be physically in place together, but not together in conversation. And conversation is, a vital element to family life. And again, if you begin to combine some of these activities, at the dinner table, Albert Borgman talks about things like focal practices, where we engage in the work of preparing the food together, the gathering together, the working together, and then conversing at table together. And these are sacred things. These are sacred rituals in the family that have broken apart or fractured in some ways, given the pace of modern life and the ways in which technology has insinuated itself into these practices. So again, I think there's been a shift in the COVID moment back towards some of these things, almost out of necessity. And, again, with 5 children, the home often became kind of just a way station for getting from one activity to the other. There was no stopping and pausing. It was a lot of running around. There might be a rosary in the evening, probably pretty rushed because it's after practice or right before practice. And so the change in pace has allowed for more space for this kind of devotional life to flourish. And so it begs the question, what we might be able to do after this. Could we repattern or remodel our own routines and rituals to make more room for this after kind of the COVID moment? We all know this idea that, modern technology has freed us for these other pursuits, right? We have more leisure time as a result of these time-saving devices, but then we forget to ask the question, free for what, right? What are we free for? And of course, the highest end would be leisure, worship, the pursuit of virtue, that true happiness that comes from contemplating God. And there's even these studies that go back and look at things like modern appliances, the dishwasher and so on. They've done surveys, and actually people spend more time in the kitchen and doing the work that these machines assist them with than they did when they actually did it by hand. It's a strange phenomenon, but it has something to do with the efficiency and the speed with which these things operate, and how that keeps us sort of working harder and harder to keep up with them. So there is an irony in that. But the more important point is we need to ask that question. If they're freeing us up for something, what are they freeing us up for? So what we want to do is focus on that true human good, the pursuit of virtue. And again, we can access that through things like connection to the natural order. But technology, when it's introduced, tends to introduce kind of a power dynamic or a disorder, or a better way to put it might be an imbalance. So if we look at that scale from food preparation down to quiet and reflection, that active to contemplative, that gets out of whack or out of equilibrium when technology insinuates itself into all of those activities and changes our relationship with them. So I want to maybe stop on this point, and then and so we can hear from Carolyn and turn to discussion. But I think kind of one of the fundamental points here, and I think this does apply directly to the devotional life in the home, is the way in which techne, or how to make things, the know-how of making, the word technology is derived from, has replaced praxis. So how to make has replaced how to act. The how to act question, which includes prudence and moral reasoning, has been overshadowed by the how to make question, right? If we do it because we can. We do it because it's possible and it's profitable. It makes life more efficient, so we do it. Which displaces or replaces the question of moral reasoning and prudence about, what higher end or what are we being freed for through that efficiency. So I'm going to just leave it there and turn it over to Carolyn and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. So I'm happy now to turn it over to Carolyn Pirtle, who is the Program Director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy and the McGrath Institute for Church Life.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Brett, for those wonderful insights. So Tim has asked me to speak about why devotion matters in the home. And I'm going to guess that or at least I hope that I don't have to convince any of you that devotion in the home matters. I'm willing to bet that we're all pretty much on the same page in being in favor of cultivating devotions in the home, hopefully, because we know that the home is our first school. Before we entered into any grade school or preschool, we were learning from our parents and guardians in our home. So the home represents a culture that parents or guardians create first for and eventually with their children. And it's a project of ordering time and space around those things that Brett mentioned, around work, around education, rest, and hopefully prayer. And as Christians, we know that the home isn't just a school, it isn't just a culture. It's often described as the domestic church. It's the primary place where those first seeds of the faith, which were planted by God in the heart of the baptized child, are nurtured by parents, guardians, grandparents, siblings, friends, neighbors, whoever crosses the threshold of that home. I'm sure so many, if not most of us, are familiar with this language of the home as the domestic church, and we understand intellectually the parents' role as the primary catechists or educators in the faith of their child. And when we think of this domestic church, we might, wistfully imagine a utopian vision of something like a Norman Rockwell painting where angelic children sit obediently and quietly and absorb the catechetical lessons offered impeccably by trained and prepared parents. And then, of course, we would laugh because that vision has no grounding in reality. I'm one of 6 children, and our family rosary either usually devolved into fits of laughter or World War III over who gets the comfy pillow. And that's actually okay. That vision is laughable because reality is far richer than an overly romanticized or perhaps even sanitized vision of this Norman Rockwell-esque domestic church. The domestic church is actually messy, especially right now. The past few months have been characterized by interruptions and upheavals that have profoundly impacted family life. Those families who have been lucky enough to escape the trauma of unexpected unemployment, for example, or even from the coronavirus itself, have still likely experienced levels of disruption to daily life that may have left them reeling. Children were yanked out of schools and their education was suddenly shoved into a screen. Working parents were tasked with doing their job at home as though nothing had happened, while simultaneously supervising their children's online education, while also navigating the rapidly changing landscape of something like a global pandemic. No big deal. Meanwhile, everyone is confined to the home all the time. Similarly, the parish church is messy, especially right now. These past few months saw the suspension of public celebrations of the liturgy, and the life of faith also became relegated exclusively to the home and on the screen through live streamed masses in many cases. And even as we start to gradually reopen our parishes and our dioceses, and as public celebrations of the Mass resume, along with important rites like weddings and funeral masses and baptisms, confirmations, first communions, the fact of the matter is that not everyone has come back yet. I returned to my parish here in South Bend a few weeks ago to my usual 12:15 p.m. Mass, and it was weird. And this past week, the number of people in the congregation was the highest it's been so far since we've been back, but it's still nowhere near where it was before the shutdown. And based on the number of views recorded on my parish's YouTube channel, an average of 422 people have tuned in for the live streamed masses these past 4 weeks. That's still a lot of people that aren't coming back to the Mass in person quite yet, and hopefully they will. But it's likely that this virtual Mass, these live streamed Masses, will continue indefinitely. The number of cases of coronavirus are rising in some places as businesses have reopened and because summer's here and people are out more and more. And there will undoubtedly be further spikes as schools reopen and perhaps even more shutdowns. So the faith life is largely relegated to the home right now. But when you think about it, this was already the case pre-COVID because most people really only spend 1 hour a week at church at most, if you're lucky. Still, the changes wrought by the pandemic have made us all so much more perhaps aware of the importance of the domestic church. And for those of us working in ministry, it's made us more aware of our responsibility to help that domestic church and the devotional life flourish in the home. So given this situation, I think it's safe to say that we have to be providing our communities with ways to engage their faith in the home because, as Tim mentioned at the beginning, people don't know. People don't know what these devotions are in many cases, and they don't know what they're missing. They don't know what they don't know. I think it's also critical to say that we have to do this as much as possible in ways that don't involve screens. Of course, we should still keep encouraging people who can't attend Mass physically to participate as best as they can virtually, but we have to provide ways for parishioners to practice their faith in the home in other ways that involve their whole being, their bodies, their minds, their hearts, their relationships to one another, the people that are also living in their home. And tapping into the richness of the devotional life is one way to do this. So here's an example. Every May, I oversee the McGrath Institute's annual Marian Procession and May Crowning. It's a beautiful event where a statue of Mary is carried through campus from the grotto to here at Geddes Hall, which is the home of the McGrath Institute, and then the statue is crowned. And in the 5 years that we've done this, we've averaged at least 150 to 200 people who typically turn out for this event every year. But this year, it was canceled, as I'm sure practically all parish and diocesan May crownings were. Now, I don't know if you've experienced this too, or if it's just me, but in my experience, people love May crownings. For young children, it is the most natural thing in the world to bring flowers to Mary and sing songs to her. And for the young at heart, it's a beautiful way to honor Mary for her sustained presence and intercession throughout their lives. So with the cancellation of the campus gathering, I wanted to provide a simple, feasible way for people to practice this devotion in their homes. So my intern and I adapted the script that we've been using for the past 5 years for the McGrath Institute's Marian Procession, and we created a simple order for a May crowning that could be done in the home using a few simple materials that most people were likely to have on hand already. We didn't know how this would be received, but within the first 2 weeks, More than 500 people downloaded this resource. I received emails from people expressing their gratitude at being able to honor Mary with their children in their home because their children missed the May crowning from their school. So I think it's safe to say that most of us will remember really well this time we've spent in quarantine. So, as ministers, I think it's a great idea to think how we can help families cultivate these devotional prayer practices together that will also really help create vivid memories of their home with their children. So with that in mind, let's think practically looking ahead. We're already halfway through June, which is dedicated to the Sacred Heart. Perhaps there are devotions to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, if you haven't already done this, that you can encourage communities to do, your parishioners to do in their homes this month. So for example, parents and children could craft Sacred Hearts out of construction paper and perhaps send them to elderly members of the parish who are homebound with messages of Christ's love and the assurance of their prayers, almost like a Valentine. A simple template and a little coordination in the parish office could easily make this project a reality. For July is dedicated to the precious blood of Jesus. It's a devotion in honor of the precious blood of Christ. Perhaps you could encourage your parishioners to think about donating blood next month, and you could provide a reflection in your parish bulletin on Christ's words, "This is the chalice of my blood, which will be poured out for you and for many." Parents could express their devotion to Christ by literally giving their own blood for the life of another, and then they could explain what they're doing to their young children. And then children who are age 16 or over in many states can participate in this as well. I know in my high school, we organize blood drives all the time. And I just think that this is such a beautiful, tangible, physical way to integrate this liturgical life with the devotional life. What a beautiful way to reflect on the Eucharistic sacrifice as you are giving your own blood for the good of another, even if you're not able to attend Mass. And what a powerful way to see the Eucharist as a sacrifice of charity and making that charitable sacrifice to help perhaps save another life during this pandemic. I think the simplest approach to these devotional practices is to be found in the liturgical year itself. What a gift the liturgical year is to us. I think we've all felt, or at least I have, the strangeness of time passing, and it passes slowly and it passes very quickly during these months of quarantine. It's a very strange kind of fluid experience of time. But the rhythms of the church's feasts and seasons give this passage of time richness and meaning. And not only that, but if you root devotional practices in the liturgical year, you can strengthen their connection to that liturgical celebration, which can be an incredibly powerful experience for people who still aren't able to return to the public celebrations of the Mass on Sundays. So if you're thinking long-term ahead, August, September, and October are dedicated to Mary, to her Immaculate Heart, her Seven Sorrows, and to the Rosary, respectively. November, as we know, is the month of All Souls. And then, of course, by December, we're into Advent. So think about what practices and prayers you could share through parish bulletins or email blasts that could be taken up in the home. Simple things that involve the material, that can involve children easily, that involve art and music and the body, and those things in the home that Brett talked about before. If your parish or your diocese has a patronal feast day coming up, what are some resources you could provide to your community to help families celebrate? Maybe you have them gather together in a socially distanced festival or something like that in their neighborhoods. Because there are also creative ways to make these devotional practices experiences of community. And I think this is really important because there's a tendency for us to think about the domestic church as this nuclear family, something that's just between, the four walls of the home. But I think it's important to remember that we want to encourage, in our thinking about the domestic church, we want to encourage it to be a vision that's oriented outward toward others and not simply turned in on itself. So perhaps you could encourage parishioners to send in photos of their Marian shrines or the Sacred Hearts that they're making out of construction paper, or maybe they're planting a Mary garden this summer. Or maybe you can encourage people to share them on social media with a special hashtag that's unique to your parish. You can invite families, again, to include neighbors in their home devotions, maybe a socially distanced procession around the block with some sort of image of the Sacred Heart while you pray a litany together. Sounds weird, but it could be a really powerful witness to the neighborhood. In my own neighborhood here in South Bend, someone created yard signs with the Stations of the Cross. And they basically put them in yards like you would a sign for any political candidate along a route that was about a mile long. And they posted the route to the neighborhood Facebook page, and people were out praying the Stations of the Cross in our neighborhood. It was brilliant, and it was beautiful, and it was so, so special. Because efforts like this can not only bond families together within their own unit as the domestic church, but it can unite them with others in their neighborhood. And then they, in turn, can become powerful witnesses of faith to the broader community as well. So I'll just close by saying that if you draw from the rich wellspring of the devotional life, and if you root it in the liturgical celebration, and especially in the liturgical year, you'll be able to keep your parishioners rooted in their family of faith, even if they might still be distanced because of the pandemic. And you'll help them learn how to draw closer to God from the heart of their home. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, great. Thanks to both Brett and Carolyn for the presentation. We have plenty of time now for questions. You can use the chat box. I'm gathering them together right now and putting them into a document. I wanted to begin with one question that I had from both presentations is, to what degree, I think one of the things that I experience amongst my own students is a reduction of religion to something abstract, and particularly Catholicism. I think both of you highlighted materiality in particular in the devotional life. Could you say something more about the materiality of devotional life in the home and what you think that reveals about Catholic life as a whole?
Sure. Brett, do you want to, I'll jump in.
I'll go after you.
Yes, so stuff matters. Matter matters is the way that I've often heard it said in the Christian life and in the liturgical life and in the devotional life. And I think, in modern life, we seem to have more stuff than ever. And it begs the question, what stuff is important? And how is stuff important? And how do we make stuff important? So one of the things that I've really missed in this time of pandemic is holy water. All of the holy water fonts have been drained from the parishes and the chapels here on campus. And I've really missed being able to just bless myself with holy water when I go into a sacred space. And fortunately, I have little bottles of holy water in my home from, the celebrations of the Easter Vigil at my parish. They always give out a little bottle that you can fill with the newly blessed holy water at the end of the celebration. And so in my own home, I've taken to blessing myself more. And I'm in the process, I'm a giant kind of mid-century modern nerd, and I'm trying to find a vintage holy water font from the mid-century on Etsy to put in my home. But I see you're shaking your head, Tim. But these are the things, like just having something as simple as a holy water font by your front door, by whichever door you enter most frequently in the home, is a signal that the material matters, and that something as simple as blessing yourself is a reminder of who you are and whose you are. Parents blessing their children, blessing somebody in your family by tracing the sign of the cross on their forehead before they leave for a trip. These things, it's the physical, tangible reality. And in point of fact, we're all wearing masks. We're all being told to distance ourselves physically. And so I think the matter and the material is more important than ever right now. So whatever ways you can bring that into the home are very important. And it doesn't have to be anything more complicated than perhaps providing your families with bottles of holy water that they might be able to pick up at your parish in a socially distanced and safe way. And just to say, these things matter and you can bring them into your home, and this is how you can use them and incorporate them into your home.
Yeah, and I would just add that one of the couple things that we've done, especially over the course of the last couple months, when we moved into this house, not an exceptionally large house, and there's 7 of us, but this room I'm in now, which is supposed to be a guest bedroom, I guess, we've turned into an oratory. And it's very tempting and challenging to keep other stuff out. It's tempting to store stuff in here, to do all sorts of things, but we feel like that there's the abstract notion of creating room in one's heart for Christ to dwell. And then there's the material notion of actually doing that in physical space, which for the child, I think, to know that this room that sits kind of at the heart of the home is reserved for prayer, is reserved for study. You can see a little keyboard behind me. As I said, the temptation to put other stuff in here often overwhelms. So it's kind of an oratory and a conservatory, but it's part of that recreation and that ability to enter into true leisure that something like music can provide. Another thing we did, which didn't work out so well, when we held our little on-screen liturgies in the basement where the television is light incense. Not well ventilated down there, so that didn't go as well as planned, but they won't forget that. So that has made a deep impression on their minds and also on their lungs. So these sort of memorable material moments that can be practiced in the home, and spaces that can be reserved. And I even think about, like, you know, I'm sure many of you growing up, you had photographs, scrapbooks, things you could touch and feel and tell stories about family life and so on. And so much of our children's lives are sort of digitally filtered. So there's a lot of on-screen recollection and reminiscing of this time in our life or that time through a photo stream. I would encourage you, and we're working on a project of our own on this, to print those photos out, the special ones, put them in books, give the books to your children. And again, this isn't explicitly devotional, but what we want to do in the home is kind of cultivate that disposition, or that perceptive quality that goes along with a material experience of our own lives, but also of our liturgical lives, our lives with God. So I think there's many ways to do that.
Great. Let's then look at a question that came in from one of our participants, which is: a common barrier to this practice in the home, to devotional practice, is not knowing how to do it right and the fear of doing it wrong. What strategies does one adopt for this right-wrong problem?
Well, I think basically absolving parents perhaps of, there's a difference between doing it perfectly and doing it wrong. You know, I think some basic catechesis around certain devotions would prevent, you know, a wrong quote unquote approach. But I think, you know, people think that they have to be like that Norman Rockwell painting, right? They have to be perfect. And if they can't be perfect, you know, or they have to be Instagram perfect, right? So if they can't do it perfectly, they don't want to do it at all. And, you know, I think that there's so much to be missed out on when you shy away from something because you're afraid that it's going to be messy and not perfect. So to return to the example of my family's rosary, like that remains, the family rosary remains one of my strongest memories from when I was a kid. And in fact, I remembered it so strongly that when I came here to the Institute, I decided to write a book on the rosary with illustrations that my brother did. And we both had a great time, you know, remembering what it was like to pray the rosary together as a family. Was it perfect? No, it was not. It was not even remotely sometimes. And so I think, you know, empowering parents to kind of push through this fear around not having the answers, not being able to do it right, providing them with simple practices. You know, anybody can trace the sign of the cross on their child's forehead. Anybody can put in a holy water font. Anybody can light a candle and say, this is, you know, or to light the child's baptismal candle and say, this is a symbol of the light of Christ. It's the light of faith in your heart. And this is the reason why we baptized you. This is why we chose your name. You know, there are simple practices that you can offer to parents that I think will help them overcome any fears that they might have around doing it quote unquote wrong, and to, you know, allow them the gift of embracing kind of the messiness and the materiality and all of those joyful things that go with it, and really kind of encourage them in that regard.
Yeah, and I like Tim Johnson's comment here that many of these devotions don't have kind of stringent rubrics. They're not regulated in the same way public prayer is. So I think that's why we say we practice religion, right? It's like the doctor says, I practice medicine. That's why I screw up half the time. But we're practicing, and it's the work and the doing and the practicing that actually is leaving the impression. And some of the ideas that Carolyn mentioned around something so simple as creating a card for the Feast of the Sacred Heart to send to somebody. I mean, this is not going to be in a rubric or in a devotional book, but it's inspired by the practice. And it's done in a little and a meek way that a child could understand, that connects it to the work of charity and so on. So I think there is a lot of, as Timothy says here, a lot of freedom in the home to explore these things. So that's a gift.
Thanks, Timothy. I agree with you. Good work, Timothy, and a wonderful name. He's our colleague at Liturgy Training Publications in Chicago. I have a question that actually links to this question of freedom. It's from Jeremy Priest, who is in the Diocese of Lansing. And he notes that Guardini draws a distinction between the liturgical and its universality, right? So in some ways, this non-freedom and the particularization of the devotional, right? So in the devotional, this is in his section on the style of the liturgy in the Spirit of Liturgy. And so he says he sees that his parishes, our parishes, and I presume he means in Lansing, but perhaps nationwide, are divided along devotional lines. The liturgy has become devotional, and pastors are often assigned according to style, liturgical style, right? So if it meets this one or that one, but not that it actually is following the liturgy itself. So can the renewal of this devotional life help restore the universality of the liturgy in our parishes? What do people think about that?
I think, well, so as a liturgical musician, I think this is one of the things that I have been asked most frequently, particularly with musical styles, right? So, often parishes will sort of separate their masses by a certain style of liturgical music. Maybe the early morning mass is more traditional hymnody, or they have an evening mass on Sundays that's the contemporary mass where they use contemporary Christian music. Maybe the instrumentation is different. The manner of performance is different. And, I often encourage parishes to rethink that approach, because I think it creates a sort of consumer-based model with regard to, and it also can divide a parish community. You can become known, among your fellow parishioners by what mass you attend. And so I think, cultivating unity through the liturgical celebration is the ultimate goal. Guardini also says in the Spirit of the Liturgy that the liturgy is where we pray we and not I. And so I think it's important to maintain the distinction between the liturgical and the devotional as much as possible within the liturgical celebration, and to do what is proper to the liturgy within the liturgy, and then to cultivate and to let people know and to educate people, because I suspect that most people don't realize that there is a distinction between something like liturgical music and devotional music. I was not aware of that until I really started studying liturgy and theology. And so, but once I realized that the liturgy has its own rules and rubrics, and that actually gives it a beauty that needs to be preserved. And so, I think that just a simple way of educating people into the gift of the devotional life, and the gift that it offers in terms of personal expressions of one's faith, and always kind of rooting that in, orienting it back to the liturgy and having it flow forth from the liturgy is also very important. But I think, the recovery of the devotional is indeed a way to sort of keep the devotional from encroaching on the liturgical.
Yeah, I'd actually be interested in what others have to say. This isn't really my area. I am reading End of the Modern World right now, so the wrong Guardini book, but I think there's something to what he's saying even there about sort of the way in which the man after modernity kind of creates or recreates the world in his own image. And I think this has infected the liturgy as well. So I'd be really curious from those gathered here or others that know, from a kind of historical perspective, you know, in what ways devotional life and liturgical life have informed one another and shaped one another over the centuries. It seems like that would be a pretty big area of at least interest, or but that's not an area I know. But it seems like we're poised for one of those moments, and perhaps we're in the midst of one. So.
Yes, it is an interesting question. I mean, in some ways, the question is how much weight can one put on the liturgical act? And I think this is part of the problem, is in a world in which there's a holistic form of life, of prayer, then a collect prayer can be prayed in such a way that you can enter into the delight of the collect prayer, because you have a whole life of prayer that enables you to sort of pray the prayer. And yet when that disappears, the expectation is that suddenly, with the first time one hears a collect prayer or is engaged in sort of the Eucharistic prayer, whether in the extraordinary form in the Novus Ordo, that suddenly, you know, it's all going to come together for you. And that much weight cannot be borne on an hour per week, right? Or an hour and a half per week. And so there has to be a kind of holistic cultivation of the various senses, right? The spiritual senses of the person, to perceive the sweetness of the Lord in all things. And so in the midst of this prayer, it becomes this way. And then it becomes, you know, I often think about how much my own life of devotional prayer actually sustains myself. You know, this panel, we're all lay folk, which means we're subjected sometimes to whatever liturgy we go to. And even in the midst of that, we can sort of delight in the presence of God that's there. Sometimes it's harder than not. So, but it is worth studying. I want to get to one question. We have questions coming in ablazing now, which is a good sign of a conversation that's working. So one of the questions we got was a little bit more about wanting to go into the importance of the body, and I think this group in particular would be, well placed to take up this question, which is one person at the last breakout we had, last conversation, said that she'd missed daily mass because with work she wouldn't have time, so daily mass was online. But how does one think about, how do you explain to someone the difference between participating in the sacrifice of the Mass in an embodied material way and watching the Mass when it's live streamed, and that there's a difference going on?
Well, I think you could, just by virtue of anybody who's had a conversation online with a person knows that it's not as good as having that conversation in person. You don't get the sense, you don't get the fullness of the person when that encounter is mediated through a screen. I live alone and I come from a large family, and I have spent a lot of time looking at a screen to try to stay in touch with my friends and the people that I love. And it is the pits. And it's not the same. It's not as good. My first experience of, participating in an online Mass it just left everything wanting, as a musician. Even since we've been back, I've missed being able to sing and use, the physicality of my breath and my voice in a different way from speaking, because speech and singing are very, very different things. And so I think, there is no substitute for being in person. I recently spoke on a panel about the role of art and music in catechesis. And, all of these students were wondering where they could go to, find new pieces of art. And my first instinct was to say, go to a museum. Don't go online, go to a museum and see something in person that moves you, because it's one thing to see, Michelangelo's Pietà in person. It's quite another to see it on a screen. It's just not as good. And so I don't think, I think that for people who are wondering about the difference and the merits between online and in-person Mass, anybody can relate to the difference between an online and in-person conversation. There's a depth of presence that's there in person. that just isn't when you're just talking to a screen. So, I mean, that's where I would start.
Yeah, and as a avid reader of Marshall McLuhan, you know, this idea that we've been discarnate for quite some time, going back to the telegraph, the telephone. We've had all sorts of means by which we are present to one another, but not physically present. So this conditioning to accept this as the norm has been a century or more old. And so this latest manifestation of the television mass versus the in-person mass is, I think, just yet another example of this. But I suspect that we're reaching kind of the not the resolution, but coming over the other side of that, in the sense that the television world in which we're emerging from was very much based on kind of fantasy and discarnate reality, sort of participating in these stories and fantasies on screen, but not really being bodily present. The digital environment and culture is much different. It's much more directed back towards reality. So the things that we tend to consume in a digital fashion, you know, not Netflix and that sort of thing notwithstanding, but the daily news, the comings and goings of our neighbors and friends and family on Facebook and so on, points back to a reality. And I think COVID has only accentuated the hunger that we have for the analog. So I think the hunger is there, and the opportunity is there for the church to become that place of community and connection that's missing right now, and actually has been receding or eroding for some time. But I think we're turning a corner on that.
So we have a question that came in from the secretary and one of our members of Society for Catholic Liturgy, who works in Cincinnati, and she noted that she thinks a good number of pastors have turned to live streaming liturgies out of a desire to stay connected with their parishioners while they are away from the celebration of the liturgy in person. Is there a way that domestic devotions can foster unity in your own assessment, not just within the family, but also in the parish level?
Yeah, I would say so. You know, I think I mentioned a few examples of how I saw that being done over the past few months, whether it was, you know, the Stations of the Cross being placed in my neighborhood. I don't even know what parish that was rooted in, but it made me feel connected to basically anybody else who might have been passing by that way, praying those stations as well. I think, you know, most parishes that, at least my parish, and a couple of others that I've kind of been in contact with in the diocese, a lot of them are doing a daily email blast. And I think, you know, that's their way of trying to stay in touch with their parish communities. And within that, you know, they'll often include a devotional prayer that can be prayed by everybody who receives it. And I think that's a very simple step to try to kind of unite the parish community in a form of devotional prayer. Another way to do that is, you know, just to provide opportunities, you know, perhaps for people to commit and sign up, and, you know, create a sign up genius where, you know, you say to your parishioners, anybody who's interested in praying the Angelus at this time, sign up. And you could either do it over Zoom if you wanted to, or you could just say to people, pray it wherever you are, wherever you happen to find yourself, and know that you are connected to other people in the parish that have committed themselves to doing that same thing. So the gift of technology is that it does allow us to stay connected in terms of our communications. And it would be a very simple way to introduce devotions to your community and also encourage them to take them up together. I would start simply. You don't want to do anything super complicated right out of the gate, but with just a little bit of you know, explanatory text in an email. You don't want the email to become too onerous, because then no one will read it. But, you know, perhaps you could point them to a YouTube video that would teach them how to pray a certain devotional prayer, and then that way you've educated them in this practice, and you're encouraging them to take it up together.
And I like what Timothy Johnston has said here in the chat, stealing his answer once again, but he does mention a parish in Chicago that's doing morning prayer over Zoom, and then people are chatting afterwards. I've heard from a number of deacons and ministers that they're hosting these kind of impromptu or daily kind of liturgy of the hours or night prayer sessions, and the participation is much, much higher than it ever would have been in person. So they're getting 60 people from night prayer, whereas they never would have been able to gather that many people together. The risk, of course, is supplanting the kind of in-person prayer experience, but as a sort of temporary substitute or as a way to kind of rekindle some devotional energy within the parish and maintain that unity, I think these are great ways. And I think you might be surprised if you do invite people, how many more you'll get just because of the convenience of logging on versus getting in the car and going somewhere, taking time out of the day.
Yeah, and I think the hours are something we didn't include as explicitly here precisely because we think the liturgy of the hours is itself a liturgy. It's not a pure sort of devotion. It's part of the liturgy of the church. For that reason, it should be done. So liturgies, in essence, hasn't necessarily been canceled. Families and communities should still and can be doing this. The one thing I wanted to say is I've heard a lot about sort of a lot of conversations I've had over this time have been that we don't feel together, which I think is totally the case. There is a kind of isolation going on. And as Christians, we can't be Gnostic about togetherness. Like we're not together and not together like in a sort of mental image. Yeah, I think it's important to remember there's a couple of things that I think Catholics theologically can remember about themselves is that there is no apartness, right? For us, first of all, so even when we're apart, there's a communion that we share in through sort of belonging to the life of the church. That belonging is a togetherness. Even when we can't be together, there's a kind of bitterness to being apart, but nonetheless, we don't just need to be in the same room to be together. I think about this a lot. You know, if you think about it sort of spousally, I used to travel a lot when people traveled, and now I'm not, right? So I'm in the same place. And it was terrible to be apart from my spouse and my kids, right? I felt that pain. But it wasn't like when I wasn't there that I wasn't with them in some significant way, right? In the case of my spouse, there's a bond that actually joins us together. There's a kind of one flesh union. There is a kind of belonging. So that materiality is needed. But I feel like we have to remind people that, you know, for example, if you're not at Mass and not there, it doesn't mean that the sacrifice isn't offered for you, right? Because it's offered for the church, which is your deepest and sort of most attentive identity. And so I often heard people say like, well, you know, I can't receive anything of the Eucharist during the pandemic, which isn't actually quite right. The Eucharist is still being offered for one, and that desire and that longing for belonging is part of that. It's not perfect, right? In the same way that spouses should long to be together, but that desire is part of it, and it's part of that offering. I have a question that came in from a colleague of mine at King's, Dr. Lizette Larson-Miller, and we might not have the questions full as a panel. In fact, Dr. Larson-Miller may have some ideas, but it's related to the Guardini conversation, and that, you know, people speak about liturgy and devotion flowing from one another. That's a stand. What does it actually mean? And what does it mean at a time when a lot of people are experiencing no liturgy? In other words, what are we talking about? And Dr. Lizette Larson-Miller, you may feel free to throw in a thought or a question if you also are in. If you wanted to, I'll be checking the chat.
So for me, you know, and I alluded to this in my presentation, I think the clearest kind of line of connection, or at least the starting point for the line of connection between the liturgy and devotional life, can be found in the liturgical year. There are so many practices rooted in the liturgical year that are oriented in the liturgy and kind of draw us back to it and flow forth from it. So you think about, you know, if a family has an Advent wreath or something like that, there's a blessing that can be done in the home that can also be linked to, you know, what they would experience within the liturgical celebration, and to, you know, kind of create these scriptural ties as well, encouraging families to pray with the readings of the Sunday Mass. We just had, the celebration of Corpus Christi and those stunning, stunning scriptural readings. Reading them together as a family, perhaps, trying to kind of plumb their depths together. Like, well, what do you think this means? And not being afraid, to not have the right answers, and maybe just being content with having the questions be raised. We talk, there is that scriptural connection. There's the connection between the liturgical cycle and of feasts and seasons. And so I think, those are two kind of very kind of ground level foundational connections that can be carried forth into the home with relative ease, especially on the scriptural line. Since the pandemic started, publications like Magnificat and Give Us This Day have been making their materials available for free for people online. And so that's a great resource to point your families to in your parish or your parishioners, so that they can, sort of start to draw out and perhaps, giving them a basic introduction to something like Lectio Divina, or providing them with reflection questions in a bulletin from week to week, so that they can continue unpacking the scriptures that have been heard and proclaimed in the liturgy, whether they were there present physically or not. They can still engage in the liturgical life of the parish and of the church through devotional practices in the home.
Okay, so she was fascinated with some of the other questions and responses that led to a potential link between devotional practices and consumerism, and then devotionalism overriding liturgy. Perhaps being interested in general, what does this mean when we go back to Mass? How will liturgy change? How will devotions change? And a leadership question, we can lead prayers now. Why do we need someone to do that for us? There's questions that are being raised. Dr. Miller, Lizette Larson Miller thinks that she wanted to raise. I don't know if we can answer them all here. But I do think the question of the interrelationship between liturgical prayer and the devotional life and the change that comes along is inevitable as one sort of grows in the practice of faith. During this pandemic, I've been entering more deeply into sort of Ignatian composition of place, particularly as I read the scriptures, right? And sort of imaginative meditation. And as I've done that, it changes necessarily the way that I engage the Psalms in the Liturgy of the Hours. And it also engages ways that it changes the way that I, now that I'm back in the Eucharist, celebrate it. It's a change, and it's there's mutual sort of movement. I always have felt my major problem with the separation between the devotional and the liturgical life is that this is fine from a purely ecclesial perspective, right? That the liturgy has one language, devotional life has another language, but the human person is but one person, right? And so what we do in one life influences the other because the life is our own. We don't have two lives. And there's a really interesting article in Medieval Studies that says, we make some radical separation between Eucharistic liturgy and other things. And that actually in sort of devotional prayer within kind of medieval theology was very, like there were like 10 degrees of Eucharistic praying insofar as it was connected to the Eucharist, because everything was Eucharistic. So I think in some ways it'd be worth probing, I think my colleague Brett brought this up, worth probing the historical development between these two to start thinking more about this interest. I think this is something my own center wants to take up moving forward in the future, because we see the fecundness of this. Well, I think we have time. One last question, and I just want to ask it. We actually have only one more question. And it's a question about the ways that devotional practices in the home can help families enter into and learn about the church's life of peace and justice together.
So Benedict XVI says that a Eucharistic celebration that doesn't overflow into a life of charity is inherently fragmented, right? And I think the same can be said of the devotional life. I mentioned before that, there's a danger in talking about the domestic church that we talk about this very insular reality, this very insular entity that's isolated. And so, pointing families to practices that allow them to turn outward and minister to the neighbor and to discover the other are essential in cultivating the devotional life. And I think too that those practices are important. So I'm thinking about in particular the works of mercy, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and really kind of educating parents around very simple ways to start integrating those into daily life where they are. Pope Francis, in an address several years ago, spoke about the primary context for the works of mercy being life as it is right now. It doesn't necessarily mean volunteering at a soup kitchen for 3 hours every night, although if you have time to do that, go forth and do. But it means ministering to the elderly parent or to the young child who can't do things for herself, and seeing in those works of mercy the opportunity to extend the love of Christ, ministering to a neighbor who might be sick, and that entails a relationship with one's neighbor in the first place. So I think that the works of mercy are a really great place to start in building that into the devotional life.
Yeah, and just with small children, of course, we do a lot of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked on a daily basis. But there was also a period, unfortunately now we can't do this, but where we would visit a nursing home on Thursday evenings, and that was put in a central place in our kind of weekly routine, as central as the Sunday liturgy, and to show that the importance of the works of mercy and charity as they relate to the liturgy. And unfortunately, that nursing home had dozens of COVID cases. Obviously, we can't go back into those places. So you find, you have to find these other ways. I love Carolyn's ideas about mailing things out. I mean, and then there's also, again, going back to some of the ideas I presented at the beginning, the aim of the home being the sort of cultivation of virtue and in the pursuit of happiness. And so there's a lot one can do domestically as it relates to justice and ideas of peace, even among members of a family. So small ways, little ways to do that as well, in addition to the kind of community aspect of it. So.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, and so I wanted to thank both Brett and Carolyn for being with us and helping wrap up our last webinar. Just to let you know, I've included a link in our chat function where you can actually learn more about the Liturgy Society. You can go to liturgysociety.org. We certainly, we run a journal where a number of the conversations that you've listened to today continue to take place. We're supposed to host a conference at the University of Notre Dame this September, but we're now going to do that virtually. It will be September 26, 2020, and we'll send some information out about that. It's going to be a short conversation taking up some of these questions. So thanks so much for everyone. Thanks, Carolyn and Brett. I look forward to seeing you in person one day again.